Rappin with ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Rappin with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer. So on today's live stream, I welcome back Mike Paletta. What's going on there, Mike?
Another day in paradise. As I'm sitting here in my sunroom, you can see my tank behind me, but it's also kind of a sad day. For those of you that don't know, one of my good friends and mentors, James Lawrence of Reef the Rainforest Publications, formerly Microcosm, passed away this week, and I found out about it today. And again, I'm deeply saddened by it. I offer my condolences to his family and his other friends, of which he had many. He was my mentor in terms of getting me to write both of my books, in that I was writing for 3 or 4 magazines in the early 1990s, and James approached me and said, we could put all your articles together and do a book. And I said, well, that would be great. It'll be real easy. He said, yeah. Unfortunately, James lied, and that is not what we did the book. We basically changed everything, and it took approximately a year. But James was always behind the scenes. He always was pushing for the hobby. He always had the hobby at heart. He not only had me publish my books, but also Bob Fenner, all of Scott Michael's books, which are beautiful fish books, Nielsen and Foss's Reef Secrets, Eric Borneman's book. He published a lot of books in the early years of the hobby that really got things going. And that was obviously long before the internet. So we shared everything. People found out about the hobby through books rather than on the internet. So he will be sorely, sorely missed, because he really was a voice of compassion and just total interest in the hobby. From Coral Magazine now and Amazonas, back through the books he's done, he's always been the main publisher of print material for the hobby.
Yeah, it is a big loss for the hobby. I had Matt Peterson on a few weeks ago, I think it was, and we spent a lot of the episode talking about the importance of print and having reliable places to get information, and talked about the influence of AI, artificial intelligence, and how that's a threat to all that information in terms of what you see on the internet, and how anybody can kind of like put together a blog post, and perhaps that there's holes in those posts based on the assumptions that are made by artificial intelligence. And yeah, we just spent a lot of that episode talking about how really things have changed over the years, and that people are getting a lot more of their information, from other folks out there, not necessarily the people that are seen as the most reliable in the hobby. So print is still so very important. That is a big loss to lose James.
Yeah, no, James came up with the idea that I should do a follow-up on the New Marine Aquarium. So for reef builders, every Saturday I've been doing a two-page or three-page beginner's piece, like protein skimmers, lighting, flow, planning, tanks and stands, refugia, and I basically have enough material to go through the end of the year. It's basically a book in two-page increments, because nobody reads a whole book anymore. Everybody will read 2 pages. So that's what we're doing there, and that's all thanks to James coming up with the idea, saying, Michael, that was 20 years ago. Obviously, things have changed. It's time for an update. And we talked about doing it for Coral Magazine, but since it only comes out 6 times a year, it really wasn't conducive to doing that. So this is basically the new series that I'm back writing for reef builders.
Yep. A couple of comments from the viewers here. Ari, sorry for your loss, Mike. Andy Bauma, so sorry for your loss, Mike. Jason Langer, so many of those books published by James are sitting on my shelves. Yep. Yep, for sure. Just to, quickly, for those folks that don't know what Mike was talking about in terms of the books that he has written, he published the New Marine Aquarium and the Ultimate Marine Aquariums, and Mike has also, not only has he been writing for a number of publications over the years, but as he mentioned, he's currently writing also for reef builders, but he's also a speaker at many conferences across the U.S. and around the world, and he was also named the 2022 MASNA Award recipient. I also want to just do some more housekeeping here and thank the sponsors for the live stream, both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine. Appreciate their support, and I also appreciate all the support of you folks out there that have tuned in, and there are a lot of comments coming through the chat, which is great. Yeah, it's tough. That's another big loss to the hobby.
Yeah, Bob Fenner, Jake, now James. It's just a lot of my old friends. I mean, it's sad. I've had most of these friends for over 30 years, and they just keep disappearing. So it's sad.
Yeah.
Oh, speaking of speaking, I will be speaking at Aquashella next Saturday.
Oh, nice.
So if you're near Dallas, you come up and say hello. I always like to chat with everybody, but I'll be talking on that corals and fish don't die without cause.
Yeah. There's usually something behind that, right? In terms of the keeper of the tank.
Yeah, oftentimes it's stupidity, but we can't fix that. So we try to fix the things we can fix.
Yeah. Reef forever, that is. Just looking at some of the other comments. Chris from ACI is in the house.
Hi, Chris.
Yep. All right. So, Mike, Aquashella. I've never been to an Aquashella show, and I'm definitely intrigued. And that's the one major show that I've never been to. So I think I need to get out there and see one.
It's a much more laid back and relaxed show than we're typical, because it's at least 50% freshwater. There's some, reptile people sprinkled in, and it's not just a frag swap per se. They have speakers. I mean, basically we walk around for the whole day talking to everybody. There's speakers all throughout the day with usually interesting topics. It's just a really relaxed show from my point of view compared with some of the other shows. It's not as huge as like MASNA used to be, but it's still nicely sized. And again, with half the people being freshwater, and we do our best to try to recruit them into the dark side. So,
and is it fair to say that there's a good chunk of younger folks that attend the Aquashella show, which is hopefully an audience that we'll see more of in terms of the reef keeping hobby?
I say yes, and also get more families than you typically see at the reef shows, because they have stuff to do. There's different various food booths. Usually they have beer nearby, so it's much more relaxed than the typical shows. I mean, they want you to have a good time throughout. You're not just there to buy 10 frags and run out in an hour. it's kind of an all-day experience.
Yeah, a couple of folk, Chris and Giovanni, I got it. They're telling me I got to come next Saturday. I think I got a fishing trip, so I'm gonna have to pass on that. But they have multiple.
You can fish anytime, Keith. You got a big tank. Just throw the hook in the tank, reel them in. You're set.
Yeah, are you going to Reefapalooza in New York this year?
No, to be honest, I don't have any room in my tank for anything. I mean, literally anything. So I'm not, I go there with the desire to buy something, but there's nothing I want to buy. I know I've said that before, but since I've made a few tinkers on the tank, I said I wasn't going to change anything dramatic, and I really haven't. Since I've gotten things under control, the growth and the coverage in the tank is as good as it's been when, 5 years ago. So I'm quite happy with where things are. Too bad it took me 2 years to find out that what was causing the STN, and then finally get it managed.
Right, you wrote about that in Reef Builders. I know we've talked about it on past live streams. So how many months has it been since? Mike, just give people that might not know the details. Just kind of like some cliff notes in terms of what you did over the past couple of years in terms of identifying and treating the issue.
Okay. Sanjay and I were actually, I miss Sanjay. Congratulations on his wife having her retirement party tonight. That's why Sanjay's not here with me. So I will try to carry the load without him. But Sanjay and I were both having the same issue where everything would be doing good, and then would see a spot on a coral. It would gradually eat away at the corals, usually starting at the base, and then it would die. Everything would be fine. A week, 2 weeks, a month, would suddenly see it again. And this continued probably for 2.5 years in both of our tanks. And it was driving both of us insane, because it didn't matter if it was a frag or if it was a big colony, this malady would manifest itself. And I tried virtually everything to see what would kill it, from high iodine, high pH, a number of different things. Nothing would seemingly get it under control. Then by pure happenstance, last July, I was at ARC with Randy and Devin, and I was talking about this, and they said, we had the same problem, and we talked to a few folks, and they said to dose with Cipro. So I went and did as much reading as I could on dosing Cipro, and some people actually were dosing oxalic acid as well, both of which are in the same class of antibiotics, quinolones. Oxalic acid is a milder form of Cipro. I didn't have access to the oxalic acid. I ordered it, but it wasn't going to be there for a month, but I did have access to Cipro. So I did the literature, and I found a dosage of one 500 milligram tablet per 100 gallons. So I mixed up a batch of that, and I had a coral. I wasn't confident enough to dose the whole tank yet. I had a spathulata that was starting to show signs of it with the base dying up. So I took it out. I did a 4-hour dip in the Cipro bath, in a diluted Cipro bath, rinsed it off, put it back in the tank. 2 days later, I did another Cipro treatment. 2 days later, I did another Cipro treatment. After the third treatment, all the polyps were out. The necrosis stopped dead. I'm going, nah, maybe this was a bacterial infection, because Cipro is a broad spectrum. It will work on gram-negative bacteria. So I decided if I saw it again, I was tired of losing corals, I was going to do the whole tank treatment, which also people had talked about. So the treatment for that was, again, one 500 milligram capsule per 100 gallons of tank water. I had roughly 500 plus gallons of water, so that would be 5 tablets. No, that would be 1 tablet for 500 gallons. So I mixed that up. I treated it every other day for 2 weeks. Everything seemed to stop. Prior to that, though, before I treated the tank, I set a microbiome test, or Aquabiome, sorry, Aquabiome test to Aquabiome, tested them. Unfortunately, I didn't realize it takes about a month for that to come back. I'm thinking, okay, a week, 2 weeks, nothing. So in the interim, while I was waiting for that test to come back, I was losing a coral here, a coral there, and I just said, you know what? Either the tank's going to die, or I'm going to kill this bacteria, or whatever it is, with the Cipro, because the spathulata was still doing fine, but other corals around it were still dying off from time to time. treated the tank with the 500 milligrams of Cipro every other day for 10 days. That is 5 total treatments. Everything seemed to stop. I got my test in from Aquarium. It showed literally half of the bar of bacteria was Vibrio. Vibrio is one of the bacteria that is very virulent and very pathogenic, particularly to acros and particularly to Acromylepora and tenuis.
Hey, Mike, one question for you, because I saw that chart you included in the Reef Builders article showing that huge chunk of the Vibrio bacteria in the diversity, the composition, whatever it was. Did they also list out the specific, because there are some, I guess, species of Vibrio that are not pathogenic. Did they list out the pathogenic types for you?
I actually contacted them and they said it was Vibrio vulnificus, which is a pathogenic one. They said that was the majority of the Vibrio. So I did this low dose, and the MIC50 for Vibrio, I talked to my friends in microbiology, was at about this rate. So I had the right dose, everything was good. A couple months later, same problem starts to arise. I go, okay, but it was a little bit different. It was actually somewhat faster, slightly faster. So I'm going, okay, what's going on here? I sent another test into Aquarium, but I also sent a test to my friend who's a microbiologist at Pitt. He came back and says, there's almost no Vibrio in the culture you sent me, but you have Arcobacter. I go, what the hell is Arcobacter? He goes, look it up. So I go in the literature. Arcobacter is another pathogenic bacteria. I go, where do I get Arcobacter from? Looking at the literature, it comes in a lot of frozen foods. I feed my fish a lot. I feed them a lot of frozen foods. Obviously, I was dumping Arcobacter.
How can, just this might be a dumb question. If it's in frozen food, you would think it's like an inert bacteria, but it somehow got activated?
It's bioactivated once it's heated up again.
Wow.
But what's interesting is, part of the problem I also found is Arcobacter tends to prefer lower pH water. My pH at the time in the tank would only run 7.65, 7.7 to 7.8, 7.9 occasionally. I was running, and I was also, because of the low pH, I also had a fairly high amount of CO2 in there. There's literature that shows if you have high CO2 in your tank, the microbiome around the corals favors pathogenic bacteria. So I talked to my friend, I said, okay, Arcobacter, I added it with the food. What can I do? He said, well, your MIC50 for Arcobacter is approximately 5 times that of Vibrio. So I go, okay. He goes, I don't know what it's going to do. I could find nothing anywhere that anyone had actually dosed 500 milligrams per 100 gallons of water. Once again, I said, okay, either everything's going to die or everything's going to survive. I'm not recommending you use antibiotics willy-nilly. I'm not recommending that you do this. But after 2 years and multiple thousands of dollars of dead corals, for seemingly no reason, because the other parameters basically were perfect and stable. I didn't get alkalinity spikes. I didn't get temperature spikes. I didn't have any of that. I couldn't figure it out other than having worked in infectious disease for a lot of my career, this looked like a bacterial infection. It looked like an infection to me. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, but I know what an infection looks like. So I did, once again, 5 tablets of Cipro every other day for 10 days. That I completed probably October, November. Since then, I have had 0 STN, 0. I've not lost a frag in the frag tank. I've had none of the colonies showing any signs of it, nothing. I sent in another aquabiome test, showed a slight amount of Vibrio, virtually no Arcobacter anymore because they have to specifically ask for that, but everything else. But after I dosed 5 different kinds of bacteria, from Microbacter 7, Tunzi's bacteria, Dr. Tim's bacteria, what's the other one? 2 other ones. Basically, any bacteria could come in, Biodigest, and there's one other one. every day I was dosing a different bacteria into the tank in the hopes of replenishing the population after I'd killed off the pathogenic bacteria. I saw no negative effects on the corals, no negative effects on the fish. The only crazy thing I saw prior to dosing that, my ORP ran about 300 to 310. After the second dose, my ORP dropped down to 200. And it stayed at 200 for the entire course of treatment and for 2 weeks afterwards. After the treatment, I'm adding bacteria and I'm doing water changes. And the ORP gradually, it took literally 3 months till it finally got back to where it's at 300 every day. So whatever it did, it killed something that was sucking the oxygen out of the water and killing the corals. So it was, like I said, after 2 years, I'm not suggesting someone that's losing a coral, because that's something else that drives me nuts. You'll have a whole tank full of corals that are thriving. You'll lose one coral, and as OCD as most of us are, we'll change the whole tank to try to figure out or to make sure we don't lose that coral again. And not all corals are going to do fine in every tank. We now take corals from all over the place and put them together and think they're all going to do great. That's not how it works. So don't do that. And before you do any kind of treatment, make sure of what your cause is. If you're getting massive spikes of things in the tank where you're getting changes, it's not necessarily bacteria that's causing it. It's just stressing the corals. A lot of things can look like STN or RTN or be a cause of it rather than bacteria.
Pests.
But in my case, it was proven to be bacteria.
Pests, you know, macro-eating flatworms.
Oh, there's more pests.
That could cause it.
No, I mean, in the past probably 6 weeks, I saw amphipods in Joe Iulo's tank that ate virtually everything. They were like locusts. Wow. They ate mushroom corals. They ate Goniopora. They ate Poecilopora. And they reproduced like rats. And whenever the eggs hatched, it looked like it was snowing in the tank. The little small amphipods would land on something, and then they would consume it. He had to treat it with what's it, miblomycin, the new treatment for heartworm in dogs. He had to treat 20,000-gallon tank with that to get those under control. Now I'm seeing people with euphyllias getting eating flatworms, which are almost impossible to see and just consume head by head very slowly. There are more pests now. As we get better and better at this, we get better and better at growing pests. And the thing that amazes me is, I remember when we started, there was always a saying, nothing will ever reproduce on our reef tanks. We have learned that pests reproduce far faster than anything good that we have in our tanks. And now we have to get them under control because we have the perfect conditions for pests. There's basically no predators for them. I have the same problem with deer here. I have a herd of 20 deer that walk through my yard every night and eat everything because there's no predators.
Coyote urine. Try that.
Well, I have tried that. I have tried mountain lion urine. I have done hair. I have done soap. Now there's still cages around the stuff that they eat, except they will leave my hostas go until August, and then they will clean them down.
Really? They save that for last, huh? I guess that's dessert.
They save that for August. Every year in August, I start spraying hot chili oil on the. But every time it rains, you have to spray it again. And after like the 5th or 6th time, I get lazy. The one night I missed, mowed down.
You got a pet dog? Phil.
2. They walk right up to them and look at the dogs because they know nothing bothers them in this neighborhood.
Wow.
They walk in the street, in the middle of the street, you're driving in a car, and they just look at you like, you know, you're not going to hit them.
They're like squirrels.
They're worse. They eat everything.
So, Mike, there's a lot to unpack here, you know, in terms of what you're talking about. I think you're blowing my mind here in saying that Arcobacter can be, you know, released via frozen food, which is just mind-blowing because, you know, most of us in the reef keeping world here use frozen food.
Well, I forgot to add, I made one change in my frozen food regimen since then. Instead of letting it thaw slowly, I now take the cube of frozen food. I usually feed mysis. I pop it into the microwave for 15 seconds. That not only thaws it, but it should kill most of the bacteria that are on it, from what I've read. I may be wrong. You may have to go slightly longer. but 15 seconds is usually enough to eradicate most bacteria on fish food.
And that we're talking about mass-produced stuff that you buy at the pet shop or whatever, or online, and so frozen cubes. That's really interesting. I mean, you know, that's a big deal because, you know, I think there's questions in terms of, can it be passed, the pathogenic bacteria, can it be passed from one hobbyist to another, in terms of, you know, water going from one tank to another person's tank? Is that possible? Should we be coming up with a protocol to be dipping frags or corals that go into our tanks?
My rule right now is if I got frags from my mother, I would dip them.
So what would be your dip in terms of preventing bad bacteria?
I do a modified Kung Fu corals dip. I do a quarter tab. This is per gallon of water. I do a quarter tab of Cipro. I do 8 drops of Lugol's iodine. I do what do I do? A capful of Revive and a capful of Melifix.
Wow.
And I also add 1 tablespoon of potassium nitrate. I bump the potassium levels up because hyperpotassium will also cause worms and a lot of other pathogens to jump off the corals. But you can't expect the water to do all the work. You got to go in with your ball baster. I do this for about 15 to 20 minutes. Some people do more, some people do less, depending on what I'm doing. The other thing I do, if I get anything maricultured, I cut it off the plug. If I get it off a plug of someone I don't know, I cut it off the plug. Granted, you lose a little bit of coral, but I sleep better at night knowing I haven't introduced anything. I think we talked about this last summer. I brought in a maricultured plug, and it had this beautiful pink algae on it that looked like cotton candy. That stuff grew everywhere, and it looked like coral and algae, and it killed a significant amount of corals. Now, I know the viewers out there are going, Mike has killed a lot of corals. Yeah, Mike is stupid, because at that time, Mike wasn't dipping, and he let things in his tank. Now Mike has gotten smarter in a year, and everything gets dipped, everything gets treated. Occasionally, you lose stuff during the dip, but if you aren't overly aggressive and you keep the water right, I have a float box. It floats in the tank, so the water is the same. I take it out. I rinse everything off. If I'm even remotely concerned about anything, I'll pour peroxide on it, rinse it again, and then put it in the tank. I mean, a quick 5-second dip of peroxide usually doesn't damage the corals, but it usually kills off any other bacteria that may be there.
You know, I always wonder, and this is a question for Eli, and I'm going to have him on in a couple of weeks with Andy on the live stream. But you know, does every tank really have the pathogenic bacteria, and they're just kind of in such small numbers in a tank that's not stressed out? And that when some sort of stressor is introduced, whether it's you know, change of parameters or whatever it is, that you know, kind of puts the corals on the defensive mode and increases their vulnerability, do those pathogenic bacteria kind of you know, are they opportunistic? Is that something that does every reef tank have some level of pathogenic bacteria? I don't know.
I would like to hear that, because my general feeling is yes, they do. And I like I said, as you discussed, is it a stressor that's causing it? Because one of the things I've also been looking at is maintaining my trace element levels and doing my ICP tests monthly. I'm doing the fauna marin test because it's the only one that tests, one of the few ones that tests for fluoride. And I now does fluoride daily. I know Sanjay laughs about that, but I do fluoride daily. And since I've been doing that, that has also picked up the corals. And I think from what I've read, it's fluoride, I want to say boron, nickel, and iodine. If you have those levels good, you typically tend to keep the pathogenic bacteria down.
Yeah, I've started dosing fluoride as well. I've put in a few of the fauna marine ICP tests, so I've got a handle on that. And what I noticed with the dosing the fluoride is the blue tips on some corals are just popping now.
Yeah. The tips, I mean, I've had a PC rainbow in my tank forever. It was red and green. Now it's red and green and purple and yellow. Wow. It looks like a rainbow. And I mean, I've never had that I mean, it's one of my favorite corals, but it never looked like that. I liked it just when it was red and green. Now it's spectacular. It's
living up to its name.
Oh, yeah.
So Ari had this quote. You talked about dosing a whole bunch of different bottled bacteria and trying to replenish the population after you use the Cipro. And I think the meat of the question here is: do you think those products could potentially introduce pathogenic bacteria? Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility. I don't know, but it was the only option I had. I also added a little bit of live sand from Carib Sea and put that in, just to introduce some bacteria from that. And I did everything I could to replenish the bacteria because, as we discussed a couple times, when I started with dead rock, I had tons of problems because I don't think it had the microfauna. I don't think it had the bacteria necessary to keep a tank surviving long term and let the corals grow. So now, anytime I think my bacteria are used up, I add this. The problem I have with the bacteria, though, is on literally every one, it says dose once a week, dose twice a week. Having worked with bacteria, if you have them in the situations right, they should thrive. You shouldn't have to add it every other day. So I haven't come across a manufacturer that was willing to answer, why do you make us add it every other day or every week or something? I know it's marketing and I know you make money if you sell it all the time, but bacteria are present everywhere. I mean, you go water your lawn or dig a hole in the dirt, pull up the bacteria, throw the dirt back in. Guess what? The bacteria is still there. I don't understand what's eradicating them from your tank that you need to add bacteria every week or 2 weeks. It doesn't make sense to me.
You know, unless the skimmer is pulling some of that stuff out.
Bacteria is still going to reproduce, and bacteria typically live on the substrate. Obviously, there's free-swimming bacteria and there's substrate-dwelling bacteria, but most of the ones that we're looking for, I would assume, spend a lot of their time on the substrate, or at least part of their time, so they're going to keep reproducing. Because if you look at where your detritus is, it's typically not in the water full of stuff. It's in a spot, and that's where you get cyanobacteria, and that's where you get other bacteria.
I want to just read Manny's Reef's comment. Keith, please emphasize the harms to our society of using antibiotics in our tanks. You know, I think you know it's a fair point. I'm not sure we know the long-term effects in terms of using antibiotics on our reef tanks. I think that's more research that would be helpful to know about. I think yeah, there's always a risk when you're using antibiotics in terms of building up resistant strains. And you know that's kind of a scary thought, and so it's serious stuff, and I think that a lot of us are experimenting with it. I treated that tank you're talking about, Mike, before the live stream, the Peninsula tank with the wall-to-wall corals. I hit that 5 months ago with oxalinic acid because I was having some similar episodes, and it stopped it, and knock on wood, I haven't seen any other signs of that since I used it.
Well, I agree. I'm not, like I said, I'm not advocating everyone to treat antibiotics if they have an STN or RTN. Figure out the source first. Do your homework. I mean, I only did it after battling everything for 2 years and never coming up with anything other than seeing that what the Vibrio levels were in the tank, which to me were somewhat astronomical. But in terms of breeding out resistant strains, I don't know if we're able to do that in a live environment. Usually you have resistant strains in a single organism. You don't usually have it across an environment. And most of these antibiotics are typically broken down by UV light, and all my tanks get UV light to some degree. They all get a little bit of sunlight. So I'm assuming that's why they break down. And that's why you have to treat every 2 days. It doesn't linger in the water for a long period of time. It typically gets broken down.
Yeah, just want to read a couple comments from Andy Bellum at Managed Reef. Compared to the impact of agriculture, it is very, very small. It's talking about the impact of dosing antibiotics. To be sure, use of antibiotics for pets should be a last resort. And then he also says, I could say that I'm going to quit smoking in order to stop climate change, and you would rightly say that doesn't make much sense, a drop in the proverbial ocean. So, interesting thoughts. Andy's going to be on the live stream with Eli. I know Andy has been big proponent of using the Aquabiomics service, and he has got a lot of data that he's going to be sharing with us too.
Yeah, they actually sent me a little bit of a blurb of stuff, which was interesting. They're doing a lot of interesting stuff that, to my mind, the two still biggest neglected areas in terms of managing our tanks are understanding coral disease and understanding coral nutrition, trace elements, and feeding. We still know very little exactly. I mean, obviously, I don't have a microscope such that I can open up a coral's gut and see what's in there. but it'll be interesting down the line as the information gets spread that we get better at this. I mean, we've only been doing this relatively for less than 40 years.
Yeah.
We've only been keeping SPS for about 30 years. Considering where we were 30 years ago to now, where we used to have heads of public aquariums tell us we shouldn't keep acropora because they couldn't keep them alive. And now because of what we've done, people like Jamie Craig's are breeding them and getting them to spawn and getting 10,000 planula to pop. You know, the hobby has come light years ahead of where anyone ever would have expected it to be. So understanding disease and being able to manage and treat it is, to me, the next frontier of this.
Do you think we're seeing more instances of this type of thing going on versus, because I see a comment here from Ari about seems like this many more bacterial infections the past 10 years versus you know, prior to then. Do you think that we're seeing more incidents of this sort of thing?
I get someone contacting me probably once or twice a week, laying out the same scenario. I you know, particularly after I write an article or speak like this, I'll get like 10 people tomorrow will say, okay, I've had this. Do you think this? And I go, I don't know what else is going on, because I have found that managing this, like doing an ICP test, you have to have everything else in line before you get to this point. You know, I've had people losing corals because they were still using a swing arm hydrometer and their salinity in their 1.030. So they had excessively high salinity, which was stressing the corals. I've had people lose corals that look like this because their municipal water authority had suddenly put chloramines or some other compound in the water, and whatever they're putting in the water was killing the tank. And they were still only changing out their RODI unit every 6 months like they had done for years, and it was getting used up in 2 weeks because of the new crap that the municipal water authority was putting in. So you have to go through everything to figure it out before, because RTN and STN are symptoms rather than the final cause. You have to find out what's causing. You can't just say, oh, this is it. I mean, we're much better at monitoring. We can look at a lot of different things, but we still all make stupid mistakes. I mean, obviously, in talking with you, you know, I've made a ton of them, and I admit to them, and I try to learn from them, and I try to teach people, look at this stuff. Look at your RODI. When was the last time you changed your membrane? When was the last time you changed the media? Well, I don't have to. Well, why? Well, I've changed it every 6 months for the past 5 years and had any problem. I said, when was the last time your municipal authority sent you what they're putting in the water? And did you look at it? Well, no. And then they find out, like I've had probably 3 friends wipe out probably tens of thousands of dollars of grow out systems from the municipal authority not telling them that they changed the water. So my RODI gets a TDS meter and a chlorine test. You can buy a pool chlorine test. They're like 30 cents a piece. Dip it in, because if they have chloramines in, the RODI typically doesn't take the chloramines out. So you do a chlorine test, you go, uh-oh, and then you see it's there. You got to do something to remove it. I use Prime to take out the chloramines.
Interesting question here, NSB Reese. Did you try using another antibiotic like ChemiClean before you tried the Cipro?
Yeah, I tried the ChemiClean. It did nothing with the Vibrio.
Did nothing with the.
No, erythromycin is primarily for gram-positive bacteria. Vibrio is gram-negative.
You know, so that's an interesting point, Mike. Why dose bacteria after Cipro dosing if it's pretty much targeting the gram-negative bacteria, right? What was your rationale for doing the dosing bacteria products after Cipro?
There probably are some positive gram-positives. I'm not a bacteriologist, and I don't claim to be. So I was taking the shotgun approach that, okay, I know these have done no harm for me in the past. They may do a little or some good. I don't know everything I wiped out with this heavy, heavy dose of Cipro. So I wanted to cover myself. Plus, 5 days after, I hadn't dosed the bacteria yet, and my redox potential was still dragging the bottom. And I'm going, okay, maybe I wiped out a lot of good bacteria that were helping to bump up the ORP. So even after starting to dose the bacteria, it probably took at least a week to 10 days till I started to see the ORP come up. So I don't know if it's just time did it, or my dosing the bacteria did it, or my doing a water change did it. But I did all three in the hopes that I would, you know, bring things back to where they were.
You use UV, correct?
I have. It's since been turned off.
And why did you turn it off?
I didn't see it really. The main reason I use UV is when I add new fish. I have found that if I run UV when I add new fish, I don't have any problems with ick or other diseases for the most part. And I run heavy UV. On my 500, I'm running 200 watts of UV on that tank. So I'm blasting whatever's in the water column. And I even run UV on the tank behind me when I add new fish to it. When I wasn't running UV, all of the tanks, anytime I added anything, all came down with ick. Now that I run UV in there, if I add anything, I don't see ick. So I run it until I stop adding fish. Once I stop adding fish, I turn off the UV.
Yeah,
and I've had no problems.
Yeah, you know, I just got some a result back from Aquabiomics. I run UVs on my systems, and you know, the diversity on my microbiome report for the one system I did send a test in was you know, not as diverse as a tank that is run without UV. And I guess, you know, my question is, and this is probably a question for Eli, but is running UV taking out bacteria that are beneficial to the corals, or are the bacteria, you know, in the corals really the main bacteria that you should be concerned with, and thus not be worried about having a detrimental impact on the corals? I mean, you know, I don't see any negative impacts on my corals, but I just wonder in terms of that diversity if that is a concern.
Well, there's even another step from that. Looking at the diversity, how much of the diversity is knocked down by the UV? And then also, is there a difference between swimming, basically freeborn bacteria, or substrate-based bacteria? Is one better than the other, or, you know, are they equally good, equally bad? I mean, that's a question for Eli. I have no idea, but that's something else I would like to know. I will definitely be watching that.
There's just so many unanswered questions, and it's good that Eli is collecting a lot of data on that topic, because I think it's important information to understand, and it's tough, man. This hobby has gotten a lot more complicated over the years.
Well, we used to get basically the same corals from the top 20 feet of the tank, and we get a diverse bunch. Now we get milliporas and tenuis, all maricultured together. Well, typically when you mariculture stuff all the same, all in one spot, the pathogens that are best at attacking those are going to be in that area. They're not going to be coming from somewhere else. If you look at a cornfield, they have corn borers in the corn. They're not, you know, have other pests aren't there for the most part because there's nothing to eat. But the organisms that eat those are typically where the food is. I mean, it's not rocket science. I see that in my garden. Every year I have squash vine borers for my zucchinis and my cucumbers that I have to take care of. Every year it's a battle between me and them. Do I get the zucchinis out first, or do they kill the zucchini plants first? So it's the same way when you're mariculturing stuff. If you have the same stuff all together, because we used to have much more diverse species growing together. Now, what's everybody bring in? Tenuis and milliporas, because seemingly that's all everybody want, because the blue light that we do optimizes the coloration of those corals. You don't see blue torts coming in. You don't see geminiferas or humillas coming in. Why? A lot of those are blues and greens. Everybody's kind of bored with those. I still love those, but the stuff that's coming in is all one.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah. All right. Here's a little switching gears here. A question from Scott Westman. Hey, Keith and Mike, I have a quick question. I think I overdosed phosphates and nitrates, which are now 0.06 and 30. Now my SPS and torches are browning out. Is that due to higher nutrients? I think. Go ahead, Mike.
No. I say that because I have played with the nutrients, and I saw the king of coral growth and coloration, Sanjay, 2 years ago. His tank was as spectacular a tank as you will ever see. Because Sanjay grows corals because he runs high nutrients and high lights. And at the time, he was running his lights. He still does this. His lights are on for 9 hours a day, all 8 of his radions at 100%, all 8 channels, 100%, 9 hours a day. His phosphates at that time were what were they? 0.7, and his nitrates were 90.
Whoa.
And I would pay you $1,000 if you could have found a spot of algae in that tank. It wasn't that was causing it. It wasn't the high nutrients causing algae, because then he brought, gradually over the next 2 years, he has brought his nitrates and phosphates down, and he suddenly started growing bryopsis, which he never had before. It was a function of some of the trace elements in his tank. If you have potassium and your potassium level is higher than calcium, it can cause the corals to brown up. If you have high bromide and high iodine and low fluoride, your corals will brown out. There's a number of factors that cause your corals to turn brown other than just high phosphates and nitrates. As I told you, during COVID, when we had nothing to do, I contacted 20 of the people that I consider to have some of the nicest tanks you've ever seen, and I correlated all of their data. The thing that I found the most interesting when I'm sitting there with nothing to do is I was running different little mathematical formulas. The people that had the most colorful corals ran a ratio of 100-to-1 nitrate to phosphate, regardless of what the levels were. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if they were running 10-to-0.1 or 3-to-0.03. It didn't matter. The corals were beautifully colored as long as it was 100-to-1. 50-to-1, they were still good, but 100-to-1 seemed to be the crucial number. Interesting thing, I don't know if you saw this or not, but Claude Schumacher of Fauna Marin stopped by my house about 6 weeks ago, and we were talking about this, and we were talking about nutrient levels and how some people perceive them as problematic. And he says they're not a problem, and he's the one that told me about the trace elements. But then he said, but the most amazing thing that I found, and he runs 20,000 gallons of a coral farm and has over 200,000 ICP tests. What we found is the key ratio seems to be 100-to-1 phosphate to nitrate. I almost fell off my chair because I couldn't believe, unbeknownst to me, he had found the same number that I had found. But he did it in literally thousands of tanks. I did it in 20.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd Claude on and definitely need to get him back on again in a future episode. But we did talk about I think we were talking about cyanobacteria and trace elements and how that if I think it was fluoride, bromide, and chlorine, if two of those three are out of whack, then that could potentially be a cause of cyano. And there's so many things that go on. I had one coral in my tank, a BC hyperberry. Well, in two different systems. A BC hyperberry browned out on me. None of my other corals browned out on me. And then all of a sudden, the color came back, and the one remaining frag I had, because the other frags, just I guess didn't survive the brownouts. But then on my other system, I had another pink millie that browned out pretty much like overnight. And then eventually that came back. So that to me is like, and I didn't really do anything specifically to try to retain. I thought it was like due to low phosphates or something.
I run a fairly high nutrient levels in my tank. I run phosphate at 0.08 to 0.1, and I run my nitrates at 15 to 20. Since I have been doing that, the color on my corals has never been better. I used to run it significantly lower, but since I've gone to higher, but I've also gone to adding more light into the tank. There seems to be a relationship between higher nutrients and higher light versus lower nutrients and lower light. You can grow them either way, but when you misbalance them, that seems to also cause problems. So it's not just one factor. And that's one of the things I liked about looking at Fauna Marin's tests. One, there's a wealth of information on their website in terms of each trace element and what it means. It's not just like 3 sentences. Excuse me. It's like 1 page of everything that this trace element can do. So when you have lots of time, which I wish I had, I used to sit and spend a day just learning about vanadium or cobalt or something, because each one of them really, from what he shows, has some impact to certain things. But so doing your homework and sitting there, there's also a list of different ratios of how things need to be in balance with other things. And once you run 5 of his tests, he tells you what your tank is heading toward trend-wise. Okay, you're running a risk of cyano, you're running a risk of dinoflagellates, you're running a risk of your corals browning out, which, I really appreciate giving a heads up, because if you can prevent it by adding the right trace elements and adjusting things, that goes a long way than having to correct it.
The ratio is nitrate to phosphate 100-to-1, right? Is that what you're yeah,
right.
Okay, nitrate to phosphate.
Yeah.
What about the opposite problem? You know, let's say you've got really, really low nutrients. Is that a possible cause of corals losing color, you know?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you remember the old Zeovit systems where they basically had everything kind of like zero. The corals always look stressed to me. They have their color, but it's a pastel. It's not the vivid, deep colors that we see with higher nutrients. I know there's still some advocates that like to have low nutrients. They think it helps the corals and fights the algae. It really, really doesn't, in my opinion. I mean, like I said, I've been running higher nutrients. Sanjay's been running higher nutrients for a decade. And if you want to see faster growing corals with more vivid colors, I mean, what's interesting is when we were coming back from our visit to Polar Reef in March, I got to stop by his house, and it was still dark relatively early. It was dark at like 7:30. Usually I'm there during the day because it's still a 2.5-hour drive home. But I was there like probably 8:30, somewhere there. All his lights were vivid, bright white, and it was dark out. I had not seen that before. And to see the corals then and how striking they were and how bright his tank is. And then he goes, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to shift it over to blue. He turned on nothing but the blue lights. And he has the corals like you see in the pictures on the internet of these, you know, saturated corals that are just glowing. He says, the colors are there. He said, if I just run blue light, they're there. But I run white light, I grow faster corals. And we've all known that. Halides grow corals faster than do LEDs. But there's heat and there's other issues with halides. I'm currently running halides and LEDs. I run a 3-hour break of halides, and I know that has significantly helped the growth in my corals. Just running that.
I want to thank Rob upstate New York for the super chat. Thanks again there, Rob. Really appreciate the comments. Keith, another super chat with Mike. I'm always learning. Thank you both. Appreciate that, Rob. Mike, a point again about the low nutrient system. Let's say you're fighting, and this is actually an issue that I've been dealing with in one of my display tanks, and that is a cyano, little bryopsis, got some problematic algae. So, you know, one way to try to attack that is to lower nutrients, right? Try to get the nitrates and the phosphates down, but then you get them down too low, and that's not good either. What's your advice in that situation?
In that situation, the thing I would do would be based off the corals every day, sometimes twice a day.
Based
them, I use a small power head, not one that blows them off, but because I'm amazed by how much detritus settles all around. And if you think you have low nutrients and you baste and you take out that detritus and put it in a tube, shake it up the next morning and test it, you'll see what your actual nutrients are. You have localized nutrients then. So what I do is I baste the corals every night, and then every 3 days or so, if I'm having problems, I'll do a water change and siphon out as much of that detritus as I can. What else I try to do is develop a dead spot where all that detritus has, so you don't have to do a 50-gallon water change to get out all the detritus. In my upper right corner, I have a partition that sits against the front, and there's 2 power heads that blow everything gets trapped in there. So if I need to do a water change, and I don't have the time, I do a 5-gallon water change, suck out all that detritus, and my nutrient levels stay where I want them to be. Because like I said, if you think you have low nutrients, based off the corals, take out the detritus, shake it up, let it sit overnight, and then test the water. You'll see what your nutrient levels actually are.
What about dosing nitrates and phosphates?
I do dose nitrates. I don't dose phosphates right now. My phosphates are high because I feed mysis shrimp. Microwave mysis shrimp, obviously. But
now I'm going to have to start adding that to my protocol, Mike. I mean, geez, there's like another step in the...
Like you said, it has gotten tougher and tougher and tougher. So I don't know why the Arcobacter... I mean, Claude told me that the Arcobacter came in the frozen food, and then I read a little bit that some frozen foods, particularly fish, do have things like that. But typically, if you buy frozen food, you cook it. When you're buying frozen mysis, you're not cooking it. So it's not a problem for the food packers. It's a problem for the corals.
How long are we nuking frozen food for?
15 seconds is what I read should work with, how thick none of your food should be thicker than your finger. So it should be able to penetrate both sides of that.
Great Bearded Reef, let's make sure to hit Smash that like button, folks. Yes, we got to get those likes up, get more folks in the stream. But we're getting a good number of people viewing here. Ari, Mike, what would you do for dinos? I guess that depends.
It depends on. I've had dinos off and on over the past 10 years. They seem to be more problematic now for whatever reason. Now, as soon as I see any, I mean, if I see one, I blast it with peroxide in a baster. And I blast that same spot and I blast all around it. It seems to be they like to be localized. I do that. Then I'll start doing more water changes. If they still become more problematic, I'll do a 3-day blackout and I'll start adding peroxide to the tank in a small amount. In a 500-gallon tank, I'll add 50 milliliters of peroxide. That has seemingly worked, but I also try to find out what the cause is. Typically, you get that when your nutrient levels have suddenly dipped. So I watch for the dip. I mean, I test everything now. I test my nitrates and phosphates a couple times a week because now that the corals are really taking off, I'm getting a much faster consumption of alkalinity. My alkalinity consumption's gone up over 60%.
Wow.
And my nitrates and phosphates are now getting consumed to the point where I now have to add a little bit of nitrate to the water.
Interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of us do dose nitrates and phosphates. That's you know, it's interesting because I've been getting some cyano in the tank and what have you, and you know, like I was saying, that the issue in terms of very low nutrients was something that I was doing to try to like combat the cyano and some of the other problematic algae.
Then you get dinos. So
right, but I'm running UV, so that could also help prevent the free floating dinos. But there are other
it'll get rid of the free floating ones. It won't get rid of the substrate based ones.
Right. So it's interesting because there's just so many different. There's a lot of things that can are connected. Right. So if you act on something, then that's going to have an effect on something else. So it's a very complicated dance that we're involved with here in terms of keeping a reef tank.
That's why one of the things I strongly suggest is do your water testing often and regularly, because if you can see trends before they become problematic, you can often head them off. If you suddenly see your nitrates are dropping relatively quickly, or your phosphates are dropping, or they're rising, regardless, you got to do something to manage it. But don't chase the numbers and do something drastic. Do things gradually and do them small. And like one of the things I've totally quit using is GFO, because GFO is really good at removing phosphates, but it's also really good at removing trace elements. Yeah. And you get rid of your phosphate, but you get rid of the trace elements, and you can't figure out why your phosphate levels are low and you're suddenly growing algae. It's because of trace elements that help to combat the algae and help to, you know, make the corals stronger are being reduced. So, like you said, everything interacts with everything else. And keeping it straight is not the easiest thing.
It's a moving target. Hillbilly Reefer. Yeah. This is a good question, I think, and basically the question is: do you or have you run a refugium, and if not, why or why not? Thanks. I think So the question is: does it make sense to have macroalgae in the system to help reduce nutrients, or is that something with a mature tank that has a lot of coral in it is potentially not necessary? And are there some side effects, some negative side effects from running macro?
I run macro in this tank behind me, which you can see real quick. This tank is really taking off. I run a refugium in the basement too, primarily for growing copepods, amphipods, worms, and stuff like that. I don't see a downside for having a refugium. The only time I've had a downside of a refugium is if my power went out for an extended period of time and the refugium went anoxic. And then it comes back on, and all of a sudden you're dumping hydrogen sulfide or something else nasty into the water, and then there's a problem. But as long as you don't go without flow, you're fine, in my opinion. And I've been running a refugium now since 1997. So I've had refugiums on all my tanks since 1997.
What about the use of live phytoplankton? Is that something you've ever done in terms of growing and feeding to your tanks?
I grew it for almost a year. I had the whole bathroom downstairs next to the tank. I grew it. I fed it. It eventually got to be too much time to do, because the question is, okay, the corals for the most part don't eat phyto, but a lot of the microfauna and a lot of the pests do. Tube worms, vermitid snails, a lot of the things I really didn't want ate the phyto. Did the bacteria eat the phyto and then the corals eat the bacteria? That's another question to ask them. You know, in terms of coral nutrition, we add food to feed the corals, we add amino acids to feed the corals, but realistically, I can't find a study that shows the corals are directly taking in much of the amino acid or much of the trace elements. But there is stuff in the literature that the bacteria are consuming these things. Well, 70 to 80% of what corals consume is bacteria. So are we secondarily feeding the corals by feeding the bacteria upon which the corals feed? That's an interesting question. I don't know. How efficient is it? Does it make sense? Do we need to do it? I don't know. I've seen beneficial effects of doing that. From adding the phytoplankton, there is some people in the literature that have had beneficial effects of adding phytoplankton for an extended period of time. I did it for a year. I didn't see a whole lot of change of when I stopped versus when I started. All I knew was it was taking a lot more time to have to clean out the chambers. You get something that crashes, you have to add it. I mean, at first it's kind of fun. You're like, ooh, I'm growing this really cool. And I was even growing rotifers and doing that. I grew rotifers for 6 months and added those to the tank. Again, I didn't see a whole lot of benefit. Granted, I run a ton of fish in my tank. I have a ton of stuff in my tanks. Could that be the reason? Possibly. I don't know. But after doing that, I have better things to do with my time than clean green buckets.
It is a lot of work. I've been doing it for the last couple of months. And yeah, you got to like pretty much set aside. It's like a whole nother thing in terms of maintenance, in terms of regenerating those cultures and making sure that they're all spick and span clean, and there's no potential bacteria that can crash the cultures. And the one thing I have noticed is a big increase in my pod population.
Oh,
which
yeah.
is great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you definitely see that, but is that beneficial to the corals or not? And what happens if you get a pathogenic or a coral eating isopod or amphipod, and you suddenly start feeding it? Are you basically feeding the enemy? Those are all things you got to look at.
Yeah, again, this is like stuff that I never would have thought of years and years ago when I was kind of like starting to get knee deep into the hobby, and I think there's just a lot more information out there these days, and there's a lot more experimentation, let's say, that's going on, and I think this is all good.
Well, that's what's nice. I've quit experimenting. I pretty much have it down, kind of like a cycle. Like changes I'm making, I told you the halide lights, I put those on a year and a half ago. They've been running. Now, since I got the STN under control, the corals are growing fast. But I've also added Orphic lights, the strip lights to the front and the backs of the tanks. So now every square inch of the tank is fully lit. I had areas that weren't as well lit as I would have liked. That has also helped with the tank. On the soft coral tank, we're getting to summer, everything's going to take off. I have a wooden stand under here that is now 8 years old. I'm starting to gradually see that little bit. So I'm getting a anodized aluminum stand from a company called Alufab that you could park your car on. I do not want to be worrying about this when I'm away or on vacation, because as we all know, when you're away, that's typically when bad things happen. So I'm putting that on. This is going to be cleaned up dramatically when I do that. It's going to be a bear. It's going to be 8 to 10 hours to take this down and put it back. I did that 2 summers ago and I replaced the floor. But this stand is on casters. I can move it if I need to. It sits off the ground, so I can clean out the stump. It's going to be much easier to main and clean. It even has a level on it, so I can make sure that it's perfectly level. So to me, this is. I don't splurge very often, but I'm splurging on getting a nice stand for in here, because this stand, when I took a picture that I was joining Reef Builders, a couple of my old friends were busting my chops saying, "It's time to paint the stand," so I won't have to worry about that anymore.
Mike, you mentioned the lighting in terms of what you've been doing, tweaking the lighting on your 500-gallon display. And in the Reef Builders article, you talked about it. You did a whole article about the lighting, and You said you learned from the experiments that you have been doing with all these different lights. I think you also had talked about the new AI blades. What actually did you learn from these experiments with the new lights? Anything you could share with us about that?
The blades and the Reef Brites, which I've used the Reef Brites for at least 10 years, both have about the same amount of par. They all produce about 110, 115 par at the same spot. So those were fairly comparable. There was a slightly, and when I say slightly, I'm talking 3 or 4 inch better spread from the blade than from the Reef Brite. But to me, they're both very good lights. They're both cause of pop into corals. The Orphic lights I added after being at fans in at
Tidal Gardens.
Yeah, at Tidal Gardens and seeing some of the pop on some of his colors of his coral. So I wanted to add something else to get that pop. I mean, you can get the pop with the Radions, you get the pop with the Reef Brites, but I'm obviously someone that always tries something. And I knew that the lights at the very back of my tank the back wall was a little bit darker than I wanted to. It was running about 200, 250, some spots 300 par. Since I added the Orphics, I'm at 400 par back there now. So everything is like popped and taken off. In terms of the front, the same thing. I wasn't getting the pop I wanted. It was like 150 down at the very front bottom. Now I'm at about 150 to 250. The corals have started growing significantly much faster. Obviously, it's not rocket science. You give the corals more energy in the form of light, they typically grow faster. So, but I'm also getting better coloration overall. And I really like the ease of use of these. These are not something I'm tinkering with. They're on for 6 hours a day till the end of the night. The halides are on for 3 hours from noon to 3 every day. Everything's on from noon to 3. I get in some spots I'm at 600, 650 par. The nose go off after just 3 hours. Then I'm at about 350 par everywhere. Then when the Radions kick off, the Orphics and the blades are on, and then I'm running about 250 to 300 at the front. So it's gradually, it is like a sunset from the middle of the tank to the front and back. So it's providing what I want.
So I'm assuming you own a par meter.
Yeah.
Because in the also in the article you mentioned that you try to shoot for par between 350 and 450, and I'm assuming that's for growing SPS, right? Are you also
for growing SPS, particularly tenuous and millipore?
Okay.
They seem to be really light hogs. They seem to do much better coloration wise at that higher par than they did at the lower par.
How much do you look at with your par meter? How often are you trying to determine any degradation of the LEDs over time? I mean, there's, I think, different things I hear from people depending on the fixtures that LEDs might last 5 years, some might last a little longer. How often are you doing par readings to try to?
Well, like behind me, these are G3s. These are 6 years old and they still work fine. I have G4s downstairs that are 3.5, 4 years old. I look at the lights probably every couple months, but I've done it actually a lot more often in the past 2 months when I was tinkering with the lights. But like what's interesting is I ran the par meter on this tank last year when sunlight was hitting it, and I had 1,200 par.
Wow, with the sun.
With the sun. From now, well, actually from the end of March through the beginning of October, when the sun, which doesn't shine a lot here in Pittsburgh, it shines every now and then, but not, it's not blazing. It's not like Arizona. For those 6 months, these corals will probably double to triple in size because of the amount of light they're getting. Then during the winter, I bump up the LEDs, and right now I've backed them off 50% because they don't, when the sunlight's on, you can't even tell there's LEDs on this tank. They're totally blown away by it.
Yeah.
Like you can see the Nephthia, it looks bright green in that picture, but this right here was one nub this big in February when I put it in. I got it at what am I saying? The Lear meeting in Cleveland in February. I put that in. That's how much it's grown. So the soft corals go nuts in sunlight. And I had in the past, one, didn't have enough corals in here, and two, I didn't have enough cleanup crews. I have since added 50 snails to this tank because I was having algae starting to grow this time of year. There's not a speck of algae, problematic algae. Obviously, you still have to clean the glass algae, but there's no algae growing in the rocks. There's no algae growing on anything. And I have 3 MP60s blowing flow in here. There's obviously a lot of flow in this tank. And I got some 3D printing cones that go on there. So the flow is directed where I want it. Because the problem I had in the past is that detritus would settle on the flat rocks. Because obviously this isn't as aquascaped as crazily as I would want it to, but it's basically, I just want my soft corals to grow and take off. So a lot of detritus was settling on the flat surface. Now with those 3D printed MP60 cones that shoot the water down directly where I want it, I'm not getting the detritus forming. The detritus is blowing off into the overflow, and it settles into the refugium on the bottom.
I forgot, in your 500, is that bare bottom or is there sand in that tank?
Bare bottom.
Are you just a firm believer now that if you set up another tank, an SPS dominant tank, that it's got to have to be bare bottom because of that detritus? Easier to find?
Not as much detritus as much as I crank the flow.
Right.
That's a 500-gallon tank, and I'm running about 50,000 gallons of water an hour through there. So if you have any kind of substrate, I mean, if I put a piece of dirt on one side, it'll blow it all the way to the other side, 6 feet away, in a couple of seconds. So I can't really have substrate anywhere in the tank. Here I have all the pumps are up above. And the main reason I have substrate, if you look real closely, you'll see there's a pair of black leopard wrasses in there.
Love them.
I love black leopard wrasses.
Me too.
And I knew if I didn't have substrate, I wasn't going to be able to keep them. So I bit the bullet and put the substrate in and directed it so but there's also a partition behind it. So all the stuff behind it is blowing around, but the front, there's a bunch of conch and sand sifting starfish in the front to keep the front substrate clean.
Yeah, John Wright makes a comment. Many experts in quotations say flow is more important than lighting. You know, I mean, I think flow is definitely is a big factor. You know, and that was like reason why in my Peninsula tank that I went bare bottom, because I knew with you know, I've got 2 MP60s and 4 MP40s in that tank, and there's no way that it, you know, unless I use some you know, Reborn or something like that as my substrate, there's just really nothing that I could put down there that would stay in place.
No. And to address John's quote-unquote question about experts, Sanjay and I were at Ecotech a month ago, as I said, and we talked to them about, on their little video stuff, about flow. And it's one of the few times that Sanjay and I have not disagreed, literally the entire talk. We both agreed on how important flow is. And one of the ways I put it is, okay, turn off your protein skimmer for 3 days. See what happens to your tank. Just about nothing. Turn off your lights for 3 days to do a blackout to kill dinos or cyano or whatever. What happens to everything? Nothing. Turn off your flow for 3 days. See what happens to your tank. You'll have nothing but dead corals. Turn it off for 12 hours. You'll see how bad it is. You don't even have to do it for 3 days. Corals are not designed to sit in a pond. There used to be a lot of flow. Going out on the reefs, when I'm trying to take a picture, trying to look at a coral, it's always woo, woo. Flows you back and forth. You can't imagine how strong it is. The flow we run in here is nothing compared with what's on a reef. So they are not designed to sit in the stagnant pool.
And is that because the flow is delivering nutrients and food and whatnot to the corals? Is that part of it?
That as much as blowing waste away from it. Corals don't have a mechanism for waste removal or excess CO2 or anything else. And as I said, there's papers showing that there's a high CO2 in the microbiome around the coral. Pathogenic bacteria and other things proliferate. So you need to have strong flow to blow the CO2 away from the corals. If you don't, that's where problems arise, in my opinion.
Mike, you mentioned blackouts a couple of times in the live stream. How safe are blackouts in a tank that's heavy in terms of you know, corals? You know, are there risks in doing a 3-day blackout? And will a 3-day blackout solve your issues if, let's say, you've got some problematic algae and you don't get to the source of the issue? Will a 3-day blackout just be kind of a Band-Aid that will not help?
It's a Band-Aid that allows you to buy time until you can figure out what the source is. I have done blackouts probably 20 times over the past 40 years. I can't say honestly I've ever lost a coral from doing a blackout. I have lost a coral from letting algae grow over them. I have lost corals from having dinos or cyano grow over them, but I've never lost it from blacking out the tank. So in my opinion, it buys you time to try and figure out, okay, I have this is out of whack, or I need to do this or something. By the same token, I'm a firm believer in blackouts and water changes. If I do a blackout, I plan on doing as big a water change as I can right afterwards, because typically I'm thinking a lot of whatever's bad in there has settled out, and I can scoop it out as much as I can by doing a water change. I mean, I'm still a big advocate of water changes. Anytime I have an issue with a tank, it's time to do a water change. And that solves it more often than not than anything else easily that you can do.
Alyssa M., thank you so much for that super chat. Thank you both very much. So much knowledge. Water changes, how often and how much?
I do 10% every other week on my 500, and I only do 10% once a month on this tank.
Got you.
Soft coral tanks are still, to me, like the dream tank. You don't do all the crazy stuff. They're much simpler. I mean, until the leather corals get to be this big, which they will, you don't have a problem. I mean, as I told you, last summer I had a heating issue. All the big corals and all the small fish died. All the small corals and all the big fish survived, which I do not understand. But for whatever reason, the big corals did not tolerate the heat. And when they get so big, they start producing a lot of compounds, and you really have to run an excessive amount of carbon to keep from them killing each other with their terpenoids and sarcophytenes and everything else they produce.
So, Mike, you've talked a lot about, lighting. We've talked about flow. We've talked about trace element additions in terms of having, your success and what's been some key drivers. But we haven't really talked a lot about pH. How important is pH in your mind, and where are your pH levels at this point?
Well, what's interesting is during the early years of the hobby, pH was one of the gold numbers that we looked at. We knew we always tried to keep it up, and it was actually easy because we were all using Kalkwasser, so it wasn't a problem. Then as we've gone to using calcium reactors and looking at other things like alkalinity, pH basically fell off the radar. Then a couple, 3 years ago, Bulk Reef Supply did their study where they showed, okay, higher pH, you grow corals at a faster rate. For whatever reason, higher pH is quote unquote better for the corals. I didn't disagree with that because I was growing corals like weeds whenever I was doing Kalkwasser and running halides 10 years ago or so, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. So then it wasn't a problem. Since I've gone down from not doing that, I've had more issues. In the past, probably since I saw you last, I have become very aggressive at keeping my pH up by going back to using Kalkwasser. And I have, again, that's another factor that I attribute to why I'm getting faster and better growth and healthier corals. As I said, low pH tends to favor pathogenic bacteria over higher pH.
What's your low and your high range right now?
My low in this time of year, when I close the windows for air conditioning, it'll drop down to 8.0, and my high will be 8.3. In the fall and spring, when I can open the windows and let more CO2 out and let more fresh air in, I run 8.1 to 8.4.
John Wright is asking, Mike, are you still using Miracle Mud?
Yes, on all my tanks. Still using it here, still using it downstairs. No reason not to. I mean, there's people that are running ICP tests on it and everything else, but I think that's just part of it is the trace elements that leach out of it. I also think it's a nice substrate that grow amphipods, copepods, worms, and other things that many of the organisms in our tanks eat. So from my standpoint, it's a double benefit. Even if it wasn't releasing trace elements that are beneficial, it's beneficial for my tanks because of the fish I keep in the tanks.
Folks, drop some more questions in the chat. We're probably gonna wrap it up in about 10 minutes. There was one question that I had seen at the beginning of the chat that I wanted to ask Mike, and that's the Paletta pink tip. The question from Dusk 194 is, do you know what species that is? And that's a picture I'm showing right now of the Paletta pink tip in my Peninsula tank.
To be honest, I do not, because there's a very interesting story behind that coral. It's around 1993, 94, 95, somewhere there. And I wrote an article on propagating corals. And I was at one of the shows, and a gentleman walks up to me and goes, I'm from the Philippines. I want to start propagating corals there for sale to the U.S. Would you write an article for me? Sure. He goes, I'll send you some corals. This is in the early 90s when you could still do stuff. I sent the article to him via the mail because there was no internet or anything. A couple weeks later, there's a box sitting on my front porch. Okay. Styrofoam box. Open it up. There's 3 corals in there. A brown one, a green one, and a semi-blue one. This is great. Put them in the tank. Don't think anything of it. The brown one stays brown, doesn't do anything. The blue one dies. The green one starts to encrust like a bowling ball. It doesn't grow at all. It just encrusts and crusts and crusts. I go, this is the weirdest coral I've ever seen. Now, this is all under meadow halides. All of a sudden, it's encrusted about the size of a laptop over the live rock. It starts to grow like a weed. My friends Vic and Lou at Worldwide Corals had a frag I gave them. It grew so big, it tore their entire reef tank down when it fell. So it's a Filipino coral. It's probably the only coral from the Philippines that is widespread throughout the hobby, but I never saw it before. I mean, I see things that look similar now, like the rainbow loom, like the Master Yoda, things like that. But this, as far as I know, is the only coral from the Philippines that got here before everything in the world was banned. And I still don't know how the guy got it here.
Yeah, wow. That is really an interesting story. So a couple of more random questions here, John Wright. I'm thinking of dosing calcium hydroxide. Do I start with small dosing or half the top off needed?
Calcium hydroxide is Kalkwasser. It basically dissolves in like a teaspoon per gallon. I use it as my top off water. I add a tablespoon a day to my Kalkwasser reactor, and that lasts the whole day. And my water, I go through 8 gallons of water a day. So I'm doing basically 1/8 of what you potentially could do with it, or 1/6 or whatever the number is. So it goes in slowly. The way my doser works, it's only on for 15-minute increments. So only dump Kalkwasser in for roughly 5 minutes of that. So I'm not dumping any more than like a liter, half a liter of Kalkwasser into the 180-gallon sump. So it goes there, it dissipates, so the pH never skyrockets.
And you're doing that on the reverse light cycle?
I'm doing that 24/7. It doses throughout the day. I was doing it only at night, and my pH was still dropping somewhat. So now that I keep everything constant throughout the day, the pH is much more stable.
Gotcha. Jerry Harkey, should I replace my Radion if it's 9 years old and still working? Well, I guess the question is it really still working till the way it was when you first got it?
Yeah, or is it working if you have any idea what the par level is?
Right.
Because, I mean, the human eye is horrible looking at par. So, I mean, if it's doing like 100 par, obviously it's time to change it for a new Radion. But if it's still generating 250, 350, 450 par, you're fine. Like we discussed, we don't know how long these are going to last. I've had certain light LEDs from certain companies. The LEDs were doing fine. The fans died. It's a $40 part. I said, I just want to replace the fan. Oh, no, you can't. You have to get a whole new unit. Oh, for $500 for a $40 fan. Guess what? I'm not going to buy your lights anymore. It's just insane. I can replace anything on an electrical thing. Replacing a fan is not rocket science.
No.
They didn't want to do that. They wanted to sell you a whole new light.
Yeah. Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah.
So we talked about this. That's a good reason to own a par meter. You know, if you have LEDs and you want to just kind of track what the par is over time, and you got some older fixtures, it's a good reason to have a par meter. And it's also a good reason to have a par meter if you're switching out lights or if you're adding lights.
And it's also a good reason to have a lot of friends that also do this as a hobby. You can go in as a group and buy it because you're not using your par meter every day. So if you have 5 friends that do it, it's actually reasonable to buy a par meter. One person buying a par meter is kind of expensive, But for 5 or 6 of you that are friends and can share it with one another, that's the ticket.
Polo Reef by Andrew Sandler. You guys are studs! Exclamation point. I don't know if that's Andrew that's actually commenting there, but it's got his name attached to it. So thank you, Andrew.
That's Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. That's
appreciate your watching tonight, Andrew.
So, Mike, you also mentioned that your tank is packed and you can't fit any other corals in there. But if you could, what would you like to add that you don't have already?
There really is. I've never said this before. There really is nothing.
Wow.
Maybe a purple millipora that I've been looking for forever. That would probably be it. I finally got some Palmer's blue millipora from you. Thank you. I finally got some blue Albrohensis that I'm hoping to grow out. I got all the home wreckers and tenuis that I want. To be honest, once you get hooked on the tenuis, after a while they're all like, it's just you're rainbowed out.
Yeah.
So I've gotten much more to where I like blues and purples, which, you know, under the halides they're spectacular. Under the LEDs, not so much. But since I run halides for 3 hours a day, and since I always am working on the tank, typically in the middle of the day, I get to enjoy those.
Andrew Sandler confirms.
For any of you with a purple millipora out there, contact me because I'm looking for a nice deep purple millipora.
Well, you know, depending on the spectrum, I guess blue could look purple.
No, blue is blue under halides. Purple is purple. Under LEDs, nothing is anything to be anything. But that's an interesting topic that we never discussed. Is that how much have aquacultured corals been manipulated so that they're totally different colors now than when they originally came in? Like I have a Stuber acropora that I got from Julian that 30 years ago was chocolate brown. Now it's green and purple and blue because it's under LEDs. The same thing with the Paletta pink tip. The original Paletta pink tip, when it was under halides, was pink. The tips were vivid pink. And when that coral was happy, some of those tips were an inch, inch and a half long. So it was this vivid green coral with these bright pink tips. Now, from LEDs over the last decade, it is now purple tip. It's not a pink tip anymore. I mean, some people may see it as pink. I see it as purple tip.
I'm showing this picture, Mike, that's of the colony in my peninsula tank, which is under LEDs. It looks pink to me, but you know, I guess again, it depends on the spectrum, and the spectrum that I am running in that tank. I got called to Tulio called me on this, but I said that the spectrum I'm running mimics the spectrum for 400 watt 20K halides, and Tulio says you cannot mimic that spectrum in LEDs. I was like, all right, well, it's close. I guess as close as it can be.
Well, there will be something coming out on Polo Reef this weekend where they're going to show the UVA and UVB coming out of halides versus LEDs. That's why Tulio was saying. Tulio's Mr. UVA, UVB, which is great. Halides do produce UVA and UVB. The problem we have is that beneficial or is that negative for the corals? No one has done an experiment saying, okay, I'm going to put UVA over this coral and not UVA here. See how much they differ. UVB, same thing. Are they beneficial? Are they negative? Simply because something is present does not mean that it's beneficial for a coral. So until we can justify that UVA and UVB are beneficial, they may have some bacteriostatic or bactericidal properties that we don't know of. Most people assume that UVC is what kills bacteria, but does UVB have some deleterious effects to it? There's a lot, like we've discussed, there's a zillion questions we still don't have the answer for. That's one of the things I talk to Andrew and Rashid at the time and give them ideas for experiments, because unlike some of the other entities that are out there, they want to do experiments that actually aren't going to try to sell you something, but are going to show. Like one of the things I suggested, okay, run some corals under blue lights versus white lights. See what the growth rates are. You can grow them under blue lights. You can grow them under white lights. See what the differences are. By the same token, I actually ran this experiment 20 years ago, and so did Dieter Brockmann in Germany. Take frags of various sizes, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch. See what the mortality rates are. Because when these people are selling you a 1/4-inch frag, the likelihood of it surviving is, from my experience, less than 20%. I don't think that mortality rate has changed in the last 20 years. No one has done an experiment. Andrew has literally 1,000 corals he could frag at those different sizes and say, okay, these are all the same corals. We're just going to see what the mortality rates are in this tank in 6 months. That would be perfect from my point of view to say, okay, guys, no more selling 1/4-inch frags for $200.
Yeah.
You're just ripping people off. I know some coral fraggers would be mad at me for saying that, but the good of the hobby long term is going to depend on people staying in the hobby. If people go out of the hobby because they spent $1,000 on 5 1/4-inch frags and basically people want to kill them, I'm not naming any names like their spouse or anything, you can't continue to kill the golden goose that way. You got to say, okay, you have to wait another couple months. Do I have 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch? When I've been in Europe and I've been to frag swaps there are no 1/4-inch frags. There's not even 1/2 inch frags. They're all minimum 3/4, some 1.5 inches, some 2 inches. That's what they consider frags. People now here call those mini colonies. No. I mean, if you break something off your coral while you're pulling in a tank and then sell it, I have a problem with that. I mean, I break more stuff off in my tank. They go, okay, by the time this grows, I'm in my 60s. I'm not going to live long enough to see this turn into something.
You need a fighting chance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just taking up space and it's not going to do anything.
Yeah, no, for sure. Andrew Sandlin wants to know, Mike, what bulbs you use for halides? Are they radiums?
I'm using Tulio's bulbs. They're like 14Ks.
The twin arc bulbs.
Yeah.
Yeah. 400 watts.
The main reason I'm using them is in his fixture, they actually run cool. You can touch the fixture. Obviously, you don't touch the light, but you can touch the fixture. You can touch the ballast. Unlike the old days when I was running the Luminarc reflectors, my poor little bald head has been burned more times from touching various parts of that while I was working in the tank. I don't have that problem when I touch these. So I'm grateful that Tulio has devised a heat sink that doesn't make the room, scalding hot.
Yeah, I have two of the Reef Brite halide hybrid pendants that over one frag tank with the they have the XHOs, supplemental LED lighting, and then I have just two, and I run 400 watt 20K radium bulbs on these frag tanks, and then I have the other frag tank has two big Luminarc reflectors with those radiums in there, and boy, that is hot to the touch. You cannot.
That is hot, hot, hot. Yeah, I have 3 Luminarcs. They're sitting in my garage because I took them out. I put a bulb in them. I let it run for an hour, and I basically heated my whole garage. So I'm saying, nah.
But the par that I'm getting under the Reef Brite fixtures are higher than what I'm getting under the Luminarc. So possibly I guess the XHOs are the difference there.
Yeah, I'm assuming they're probably close. I'm just running 250 waters. I used to run 400. When I had my 1,200 gallon tank, I ran 9 400 watt under Luminarcs. That's why it had its own 1 horsepower chiller, plus an air conditioning unit for that.
Yeah, room. You don't want to have to be running chillers and whatnot and AC in a tank room. But that electricity bill will get very expensive.
No, the electricity bills already are insane. I mean, I'm sure the same for you. They bumped our electricity rate by 30%, and that's just insane.
I'm thinking of investing in some solar panels. I need to cut that electricity bill down and make that big investment.
It's good the first couple of years when you get the subsidy from the government, but then it basically is a wash situation. I ran the numbers, and they try to sell me on a 30-year program, and basically I'm taking out a 30-year mortgage to pay them on technology that if it doesn't improve in 30 years, I'm in really bad shape.
Interesting.
Plus, I would be over 90 by the time it was paid off. I don't think that's a really good.
Well, on that note, Mike, I think we're gonna end the live stream. Any final thoughts for the viewers out there?
No, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do in these Reef Builders articles and in the talks and stuff, I'm trying to bring the fun back to the hobby. Talking with Sanjay and talking with a lot of other people, one of our big concerns is too many people are now getting into this hobby thinking they're going to make money at it, rather than thinking they're going to have fun at it. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I try to have fun with it every day. Goofy as I am, I still think this is fun. My wife may disagree on that it's not fun whenever alarms are going off or water is splashing or I'm almost electrocuted. But I still try to have fun, and I try to make it fun for everybody else that's in the hobby. So that's one thing I suggest. Try to have fun. Try to make as many friends as you can, because with the loss of James and Jake, I've lost 2 really good friends in the hobby. Fortunately, I have a lot of other friends that I've had for 20 and 30 years. This is a hobby that once you get into with other people, it's a lifetime hobby that you can share with your friends and you can have fun with. And it's like golf or poker. You can always talk about what happened, what could have happened. That's why we like those sports so much. We always talk about the last hole or the last hand. Now we talk about the last tank, the coral I had, or how that fish found a spot. There was a 1/4 inch and jumped out. There's always something to discuss with that. That's what, to me, makes this hobby fun.
Yeah, sharing experiences really, I think, is huge, right? Because that's how we learn from one another in terms of if somebody's having an issue and you're just having the conversation. I think that's such an important thing versus just being kind of connected digitally. It's great to have the one-on-one relationships or kind of getting together at these shows like you're going to be at Aquashella and you know, there's nothing like being in person and having these conversations because they're just, I think, a lot more beneficial overall.
Yeah, I think the human factor is something that shouldn't be taken out of this hobby because we're all in this together. I mean, the one thing we forgot to talk about is what's happening in Florida.
Yeah.
That they're potentially trying to shut it down. So any of you that are in Florida or anywhere, talk to your legislatures and sign the petition, not to get them to blacklist or whitelist the entire hobby. Because the hobby may be shut down significantly or completely in Florida if all of this nonsense passes. They have to do something for invasive species because they now have zini in the Caribbean taken over and lionfish. But obviously you can't fix stupidity, and these people were stupid for introducing these kinds of things. But you can control things and make things better. And if we all work together, we can do that. So, I mean, I'm not trying to get you all to sit, but we all have to work with this together.
Yeah, Mike is talking about that petition out there, and I know that some of the big, I know Top Shelf Aquatics on their Facebook page has a link to it. I think there's other links to it on Facebook, so it's pretty easy to find. Just please read that, and if you agree with it, sign that petition. It's very, very important. That would be devastating. Mike, it looks like
because if Florida goes, I expect that California, New York, and other places won't be far behind. So it will be devastating to the hobby.
Mike, it looks like the blue spectrum is kicked in on the tank behind you because you're pretty much.
I know, I've gone completely blue.
You got completely blue. No, that's all right. I was just joshing at the end of the live stream here, but
there we go.
There you go. Greg Carroll's in the house. Greg, what's up, man? Greg. Now that you're in the live chat, I'm confirming 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is. We're on, right? I'll DM you.
See, I think that was better when they could only see me like shadow. It was like I was, a witness when I was talking to you.
I got it. Yeah, awesome. Well, listen, Mike, thank you again so much for being on the live stream. And we're gonna have both you and Sanjay on again at the end of August. And yeah, it's too bad that Sanjay couldn't make it, but always a pleasure talking to you, Mike. And I think everybody out there really appreciates your insights.
Great talking to you as well, Keith. I look forward to sharing the screen with Sanjay in August.
Yeah,
he'll have visited here once, and I'll have visited there once. So we'll have lots to talk about.
For sure. All right. Well, listen, thanks again, Mike, for being on the live stream. I also want to thank both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine for sponsoring and supporting the live stream. I also want to thank all you folks out there for tuning in and appreciate that. Also, big thanks to Paul, the moderator, who's also the president of Boston Reefer Society. Please join and support your local reefing clubs. They are so, so important to this hobby. Also want to let you know that all episodes of Rappin With ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. My next Rappin With ReefBum live stream will be on Thursday, May 25th, taking next week off from my fishing trip. That's going to be with Dr. Eli Meyer from Aquabiomics and Dr. Andy Bauma from, well, he's a science educator and hobbyist. So, and he's been doing a lot of work with Eli, so that's going to be a very interesting live stream. Should be another great show. If you want to check out the full upcoming schedule of guests on Rappin With ReefBum, just visit reefbum.com under the YouTube section. My next live stream, though, is this Saturday. I have a big live coral show on YouTube, Saturday, May 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I just fragged the hell out of my my display tank. So there's going to be a lot of juicy stuff up for grabs on some very deep discounted prices. So please check out the live stream on Saturday at 3 p.m. So until next time, be safe and be well, and we will see you later.